Welcome everybody to Imagining a Fairer Future. This is an event run by the Social Change Initiative, SCI, which is an organisation that aims to secure progressive social change so that communities become fairer, more inclusive and more peaceful. And we're here today partly because SCI and many of us have been wondering about, with the COVID-19 epidemic, how are activists facing up to it to see if, rather than just returning to what was there before, we could actually use the experience of the pandemic to try to think about how to build a fairer future. SCI have put together a short video, and then I'm going to introduce some panelists to discuss the video. This video comes from the perspective of activists across the world, from the SCI network, to discover how they are responding and to learn what the pandemic means for the issues that they're working on.
What's so significant is that it's given a shared experience of a moment of incredible disruption to everybody. Now, of course, that experience is really different between the rich and poor, between people who are in a very crowded house and people who are in a very lonely house. But so it's not that the experience has been the same, but there's been a commonality of having our lives turned upside down.
Yeah, so COVID-19 really has shone a spotlight on the existing social and health inequities globally. The fragmentation of society that we've all experienced as a consequence of COVID is having quite profound implications for our mental well-being. And we know that that's very, very socially distributed because of some of those social resources that more socially advantaged groups already had, and that's just acting in a bit of a protective way.
So what we saw in South Africa, a country which is already has a very, very high unemployment rate, is that millions of people lost their jobs last year, and that in fact pushed unemployment up over 50%, youth unemployment up to over 70%. And so we saw real economic devastation, poverty and hunger, and the government's response to that, particularly in the initial period, was woefully inadequate. And we did then see the mass mobilization of ordinary people to support others who were in need.
What the pandemic revealed to us, as it revealed to, I think, everyone around the world, is that there were certain communities who were disproportionately affected. And in the United States, that has been communities of color. Obviously, those of us who are part of communities of color have been working on these issues, have known this for quite some time. But I think for a lot of other people, it was sort of a reveal in terms of the disparities.
In Greece, the pandemic found the country struggling with several crises: migration crisis in the borders, economic, financial, ongoing crisis. And in this sense, both the pandemic and the consecutive lockdowns in the country have collided with these long-standing structural inequalities that were already there. So the main issue that we are facing is that the access to these groups has also been at stake the past year. It was difficult already to help and support and enhance and empower these communities, and this has become much harder. Imagine having a lockdown with the main guidance from the government being you have to stay at home and at the same time be a homeless person.
So what do we need for a fairer world? Isn't that such an interesting question at this time in our lives? I think we need a global social vaccine. If we're going to do something that is about a fairer world, then we have to address some of the underlying inequities in power, money and resources, which in turn affect the inequities in people's everyday living conditions. A social vaccine would inoculate us against the inequities within society. It would mean that we would have communities that were supported. It would mean that we have individuals, societies around the world that were supported to lead a flourishing, healthy and decent life. We need a broad coalition of voices, a social movement that is pushing in a concerted way, raising the public and the political consciousness around the sorts of issues that matter for a fair, society.
Protections and rights is not being given by clapping and lighting a candle in the window. It's being given by people in the power, who has power. So it's about who we as a society going to put in the position of power, how our voting is going to change. Is it going to change? Who are we going to value in the society? Are we going to keep value people who went to college and now work as, as graphic designers and marketing executives? Or are we going to value the same equally people who are picking our rubbish from the street and are cleaning our hospitals and producing our food in very difficult conditions? And I didn't see that really yet, that change to happen. So that's why it's very difficult to talk about hopes, because we've been a year in this system, in this situation, and a year didn't really change much in people's perception. And maybe that's because our lives, as much as difficult they still are not very much affected, because we still can get our food produced, delivered to our doorstep, and we can stay at homes in the safety of our homes, because other people are providing the services for us to continue our lives in an as normal way as we could possibly imagine in these circumstances.
In order to create a fairer world, I think we need to pay attention to a couple of issues that we don't tend to really pay attention to. One of those is the impact of systemic racism and white supremacy, particularly in the United States. We want to make sure that really targeting systemic racism and white supremacy is a core practice and policy that is taken on, at least here in the United States. The second is really thinking about the economy. It is clear, and there are many demands, that we need to make sure that people have access to a safety net, that it is not corporations that get a bailout, but it is that people are positioned first.
There's a bunch of things to fix. People want to see change. In most countries, UK, for example, it's about 2/3 of people saying there's really significant broken things that we need to fix in our society. There's an appetite for change. We don't want things just to go back to how they were. And so those are things about the unfairness and inequality of society. They're about how we deal with protect our environment. They're about the kind of communities that we live in the future. But also, I think there's a message that politicians are going to be slower to learn, but they really need to hear it. They want people to work to find common ground and find practical, real, creative solutions and work with local communities. And that's something it's hard for politicians to change, because they're so used to playing the game of the culture wars and conflict. But I think that this is a moment that has shown that the leaders who have sought to knuckle down and do the work and play less politics and just do their jobs have really been rewarded.
The most important need, and this is the main thing that we have to work on, is that people need to feel connected again. The main thing that the pandemic took away from us is the connection to other people. So these connections, of course, this connection has many levels. One is the online connection. The other is the connection in the sense of the feeling that what we do actually has an impact on our lives.
I think that the pandemic, the fact that it has affected all countries of the world, and that it's been, devastating, including in the sort of global north, has given people a sense, I think, of what life is like when you are faced with a pandemic like this. And when you are unable to you're unable to enjoy the rights and the comforts which you usually are. So I'm hoping that that experience is something which sort of translates into a better understanding of the kinds of inequality and reality that people face in most parts of the world. So that is what I'm hoping. I'm also hoping that the kinds of solidarity, the kinds of organizing that was built, including transnationally, that can be continued and that can be built on. And I'm also hoping that the kinds of sort of more, I would say, positive or progressive policies and interventions which came about in this crisis situation, that can also be continued and lead us to a different reality and a much fairer world.
So we heard there from a number of activists, both their fears for the future and their visions for a fairer future and what it would take. My name's Christine Bell, and I'm chairing now a panel of activists and people working with community level or engaged with issues of justice, social justice, and legal justice. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce them and welcome them here today. So first of all, I have Camila Manju, who's originally from Mauritius, but has lived in UK, Ireland and France and Northern Ireland for the last 12 years. And she's got a keen interest and expertise in intercultural dialogue and works extensively with the voluntary sector and grassroots organisations. I'd like to welcome then, welcome, Seamus Kaur, who's a community development activist and manager of the Black Mountain Shared Space Initiative, who works building relationships between communities across one of what are termed in Belfast peace walls. And I then would welcome Debbie Waters, who's co-director and founder member of Northern Ireland Alternatives, which is a community-based restorative justice organisation working with grassroots loyalist communities. And finally, welcome Una Boyd, who's the Migration Project Coordinator with the Committee on the Administration of Justice, an independent non-governmental organisation that seeks the highest standards in the administration of justice based on international human rights instruments in Northern Ireland. So welcome today. I just wanted to begin by saying, there was both kind of a really strong story came through the video of deepening inequalities in ways, and yet the imagining fairer vision is challenging people to say, but actually these have come from really broken systems. Can we imagine what fixing them might look like? I wondered, just to begin maybe with the more difficult side, which is where we are at now. Did the stories resonate with you, and how are you experiencing the situation around social justice and equality and the work that you do? Una, could I maybe talk to you? I mean, just in your migration work, are you doing the same work you did before COVID, different work? And how are you seeing that play out?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, when the pandemic started, there were sort of urgent needs and urgent sort of changes and responses that were needed. But I would say, and I think this is reflected in the video, that a lot of what happened, I think it was Deepa said, we knew that those issues already existed. We knew those inequalities already existed. And it was no surprise to anyone working in the field, working with the communities. But what was really interesting was it seemed to come as a surprise to a lot of people in power, or at least they acted like it was a surprise. So it was a really crucial moment, I think, because you would think and you would hope that COVID exposed some of those issues, those existing inequalities, those sort of cracks in society, to the extent that it really did force people in positions of power to react to them in a way that they hadn't before. For us, there was a big focus on addressing the existing UK immigration policies are, inherently discriminatory. They're inherently racist before COVID even happened. And what we saw was those policies led to the inevitable consequence, which was people from the migrant community living here were disproportionately impacted by COVID and by the pandemic. And a lot of the work we did shift focus to try and get urgent needs dealt with. But also then to...
Sorry, can I ask, what were those impacts? Was it around access to services or...
Yeah, across the board, access to services, excuse me, access to information, things. So I'll give a couple of examples. It's maybe the easiest thing to do. So a person living here on quite a large amount of visas, like a spouse visa, their visas are subject to something called no recourse to public funds. So that is, as it says on the tin, it means you can't access public funds like benefits. Now, a lot of those people lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic, but they became some of the only people in our society who had then absolutely no safety net. Even though they had been living here, working here, paying taxes, they couldn't access a lot of the even emergency funding. Another issue that quickly came up was hostile environment policies mean the Home Office, the NHS shares data on migrants who access healthcare with the Home Office, which has the natural consequence of people who maybe are concerned about their status or even just afraid of the Home Office don't access healthcare when they maybe need to. And obviously during a pandemic, that was a huge issue. And we had to really quickly move to get confirmation that for COVID treatment, people wouldn't have their data shared. It's issues like that. And it's really, it's everything. It's across the board.
It's really interesting, that last one, though, because you can see there would actually be a government interest in ensuring people did access testing and things on COVID.
Yeah.
Camilla, can I turn to you and say, how did you relate to the video, and how do you see those same issues playing out in your work?
So I work in the health service, but I also work in the community, and I have to say, none of what was said in the video came as a surprise. I concur with what Una has said there, that it is surprising that it came as a surprise to people that there was existing inequalities. I mean, even looking at the data, that despite making up 14% of the population in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, 34% of the critically ill coronavirus patients were from the ethnic minority background. So these are things that were already forewarned. If you look at reviews from 2010, that we knew that there were ignored communities with poor condition, and how the outcome on the whole are even worse for these ethnic minority population. So I don't know how this comes across as a surprise when we've always known that there were inequalities, whether it was not only access to services, structurally itself, how racism has panned out, whether it was through education, health, funding. There's a whole load of issues as to how the coronavirus has affected the society itself. But I have to agree with the fact that we have seen an uprising of people wanting to help. Even despite having a full-time job myself, we were able to mobilize a lot of people on the ground. We knew the risk we were encountering by being exposed on the front line, but we were still very willing. And for me, that's what came out of it, the positive side of it.
That's interesting. Debbie, I'm wondering how you even manage to do work that's really about restorative justice and building relationships. It's the one piece that I think is really hard to do online and things. I just wondered, how have you seen those issues play out, the same issues play out in the work you do in restorative justice programs? And I guess it would be interesting to hear, how have you managed to keep that sort of work going?
Yeah. Christine, can I just start by saying I echo and support everything that has been said by my colleagues here. I do think the huge issue is the inequalities, even as an organisation working predominantly within loyalist communities. We worked during the pandemic and during our COVID response a lot with ethnic minority families. And really that's because people are living in our communities and they're just struggling. And with, like Camilla, what I was really, really encouraged by was the community response. So people did put themselves at risk to go out and to deliver meals. Now, really, we put in place all of the appropriate measures. But the question was, if communities, if we don't mobilise and do that work, who will do it? Because what we saw very clearly, and for me, this is about the empower and balance, in many statutory and in some voluntary organisations, we saw the shutters being pulled down and people just not being present on the ground. And my question, I suppose, through a restorative lens, when people are truly suffering, who comes and stands in that space to help heal the hurt and address the inequality? And my experience is it's the community itself, because the community itself are the ones that knows what the suffering is like. So when I say we continue to do the work, community volunteers mobilised right across the piece in their hundreds to cook meals, to deliver meals, to get out on the ground, to collect prescriptions for the elderly, the vulnerable, the people that couldn't do that. And actually, I think local chemists, local pharmacists, at local churches, all were taken by surprise by the community response. And I think that was a worldwide phenomenon. So when people are hurting at most, it's socially disadvantaged communities that come together to help address that hurt. In terms of your question about restorative justice, and it's taken me a while to get to that, but what we also saw was that crime didn't disappear. People being under paramilitary threat didn't go away. Shootings didn't just disappear overnight because we had a pandemic, and neighbourhood disputes didn't disappear because people were still arguing over issues like kids playing in the street. And in many socially disadvantaged communities, if you don't have a garden, if you don't have space, if you're not living in a wealthy area with access to green spaces, what do you do in that space? You still have to find a way to manage that. So we still were intervening in issues of conflict. We still were intervening in issues between the police and in the community. A lot of those issues still did take place, issues of racism, issues of hate crime. So we had to find a way to manage that. And in the initial lockdown, people laughed at us, but in the initial lockdown, we were actually doing mediations in people's front gardens. Because the weather was good, we were able to do that. We had to be really innovative, really responsive, really reactive, and just do what needed to be done in the space. So did we wrap that up in a mediation theory? No, we didn't. We just responded to the need and we got on and did what needed to be done. And I think all of my community colleagues did the same. We just got out and needed to be done. And maybe now we're looking back and we're being reflective and we're seeing it through a theoretical lens. But for us at the time, it was just about managing the situation and really getting on and mediating between people and the police, trying to bring a restorative lens to the work on the ground and trying to ensure that the police responded appropriately to situations on the ground that didn't require an overreaction because we were in a pandemic.
It's really interesting. Seamus, I wonder what your experience was. I mean, you're trying to build shared communities at the same time, and yet there's this curious thing of, solidarity on one hand, but also I don't think, speaking personally, lockdown doesn't always improve your capacity to deal with tensions because it's quite a stressful situation in itself. I just wonder how that played out in your work.
Yeah, no, a lot. What Debbie said, I mean, we would have seen that then sort of transpiring in a different setting, because the conversation is different and the sort of narrative is different and our engagement is different. We're both communities. So listen, I mean, it also created an opportunity for us because we when you're constantly talking about sort of peace impact and you're constantly talking about gates, walls and relationships, then this created an opportunity for both communities to show a different side. And I have to say, I mean, we were quite taken back by the response of both communities and the willingness for both to engage and support each other. And not only in the first number of weeks in March and April. I mean, this is still ongoing, and it transpired up in right up to Christmas, where we basically launched a joint initiative for both communities to basically raise funds to support families who were suffering or who had been sort of paid off, were unemployment and that. So, I mean, and that created a dynamic I'm hoping that we can sustain and build on going forward.
Have there ever been anything like that before? I mean, it sounds interesting.
No, well, not till the level that we've seen. I mean, in relation to volunteerism, I think we had in the region between both communities in the region of 100 volunteers, and that ranged from, I mean, purchasing I think we were delivering in the region of 700 parcels per week into both communities. We were putting out 400 ready-made meals. So we were sharing sort of transport. We were sharing anything that came into the middle. And whatever that resource was, we basically checked to see if the other community could use some of it or needed it and whatever. So listen, as much it has had its challenges. And we're talking about communities. I mean, we're talking about working class communities here who have literally suffered at every end of this. And when you look at the unemployment levels and the sort of ever sort of demand coming in relation to sort of food parcels, housing, every element of some sort of support that would be demanded or needed from the government. The demand has been through the roof in these communities. And unfortunately, at different junctures, then these communities, and I mean, you're talking about sort of relationships and you're talking about politics, it creeps in. And one of the things that became a challenge also, Christine, was at the outside, both communities were looking either to Dublin or England or Westminster, and that created a dynamic because at that stage then there was a different level of response coming from either side, and there was a case of trying to manage that also because Boris Johnson had made a statement or Leo Varadkar had made a statement. I mean, again, trying to manage the expectations of a community in the middle of all this. Now, we sit at the minute with that insecurity still because we don't really know, or these communities don't really know of what's really coming for them next. So we need to be out there. We need to keep engaging with the communities and keep reassuring them that we can support them more so than having that conversation around a wall or would you're are you any more secure now because of what we have done or we've come through together and whatever. So for us, we need to keep on top of it. We need to build on it. And that will create a dynamic for that shared space or that shared community going forward, Christine.
So, I mean, that's interesting. Turning to the sort of future now, for all of you, I think when lockdown happened, everyone felt, it's really revealing the fractures in the systems. But now that we're in it and we're still in it, and although it feels a bit optimistic for coming out, there's a lot of insecurity about that. And, I know speaking myself as a working mom and I'm pretty much fed up with homeschooling and work, and there's this fear of that we're into austerity maybe times 10 when it seemed to create a lot of the problems. So how do you hold on in the work you're doing? And what would be what would be a collective thing that you would ask for that might sort of start to make the connection to some sort of transformation coming out of this? You know, how are you going to support the communities you work with for their energies? Where are their energies at? Because as lockdown has continued, it's felt like we're all just holding it together to get through lockdown. And I see that really as a big challenge. The money may not be there, but the hope might not be there, and the energy might not be there. Is that right? Or is it more positive? And what are you able to do in these really creative organizations you work for to do that? Seamus, maybe just you respond there while you're there.
No, the tale is the money isn't there, Christine, but I mean, in reality, the money is there. And listen, we are holding it together, and there's many families out there who are holding it together. Many families, probably two of the husband and wife probably on furlough at this present time, and whatever. Like that bubble is going to burst at some stage. I mean, the insecurity is there, the concern is there. There has to be more investment, and the investment, unfortunately for us, is being dominated by the conversation at Westminster. No, we need more resources coming in. For me, if it doesn't happen, then I mean, in 6 to 12 months' time, I think it's only then will we really see the impact of COVID coming in particular to working class communities.
And Camilla, if that's true, what sort of activism is needed to try to turn that around?
I actually want to reflect on what Seamus said, even in the language that we use whenever we talk about communities, the fact that, I mean, it's no criticism, because sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing that. Seamus talks about two communities. And this has always been sort of an issue that I've found, that in any conversation that we have in Northern Ireland, everything is divided into green and orange. And somehow ethnic minorities doesn't seem to fit into either of those. And I find that this is quite problematic in any discussions that we have, because we need to realize that ethnic minorities have been on this island for centuries, and in Northern Ireland since its formation. And they need to be involved in all of these discussions as to what's happening on the ground, because in the manner that we speak, ethnic minority, Black and Asian minority communities are not a part. They are a part of the society, and unless and until we even acknowledge and realize that, we are not going to move forward. Because sometimes you find in Northern Ireland, we look at communities depending on the voter base, but it would be really interesting to see with the census coming up as to how many actually there are, because seems to be a perception that a lot of people are not voting. But now that we have seen what is actually happening on the ground, that just because communities are gathering together, I take it the point from Seamus and Debbie, just because communities are gathering together and helping as a community, it is essentially not their job. It is not my job. I have a full-time job that I'm doing the voluntary work shouldn't be something that I am taking on. Seamus is right, the money is there. It's about how we are actually distributing this money. Even
so
whenever it
what
comes,
would be the leverage, like even collectively, around the types of organizations you're involved in? Like what do you see as a role of sort of activism to try to create that collective leverage?
Yeah.
Whenever it comes to funding itself, there's this, I think it's 40, 50, 10 or 40, 40, 20, whenever it comes to giving funds to communities. So for example, somebody who is from an ethnic minority, but still Catholic or from a Protestant background, they don't fall into the 40-40. They fall into the 20. They fall into the ethnic minorities. So they are essentially not getting the funds to do the work that they have to do. And what I have found that there is gatekeeping in the communities as to who has access to the money pot to do the work. you'd have organizations that would be coming in and saying that they work with ethnic minorities, but the heavy lifting is essentially being done by the grassroots organization, and it becomes a tick boxing exercises that we are working with these communities, but it could be just one project that we are working on rather than sustainable, consistent work that would see true inclusion and integration.
So Debbie, that was one thing that struck me. Thank you. One of the people on the video said that really what needs to change is that there needs to be just a much more direct connection between politicians and communities. They need to listen to communities. And I was thinking, it seems to me that's so true of a lot of work and a lot of service delivery. And I wondered, is there something you think would be a sort of step change for governments, whether it's the Northern Ireland government or Westminster government, and how they would do that? Because it's sort of really easy for everything to default into business as usual.
Yeah. I think, Christine, that's going to be our challenge moving forward. When you're in a crisis, everyone's saying to ourselves, we'll never go back to the way we were. Mm-hmm. This is an opportunity for real change. And within a few weeks of things going back to a semblance of normality, we're all begin to behave the same way, and government will begin to do that unless we continue collectively to challenge them about structural and systemic change. So what I'm hearing from the group is that really marginalised organisations need to have a voice in how policies are shaped and how policies are delivered and made. And that, if you look at this jurisdiction, we don't even have a policy on poverty. We don't have a poverty strategy. We're only now beginning to develop a mental health strategy. Think about the importance of those strategies as part of COVID recovery plan. They are so significant. So what we need to do is move out of the green and orange lens, which we've talked about, and really begin to look at inequalities and look at social disadvantage right across the piece. Because no matter what community you're from, as Seamus and Camilla have said, there are communities suffering these inequalities. How do we hold our politicians to account for that long-term sustainable change? Part of why it's difficult for us as community activists is when things go back to normal, where are the organisations that take the cut? So often it's not the statutory agencies that take the cut to funding, it's the community organisations. It's very, very easy to cut from the grassroots because of our lack of political clout. And I think that's why organisations like Social Change is really important, because they can bring together the key activists to help and empower us to do the right kind of lobbying and to lobby people in power and to say, we're not going to resort to type. We want to see real change in terms of poverty, in terms of inequality, and in terms of mental health strategies, and truly begin to hold our politicians to account right across the piece. Let's not lose the learning. Let's not go back to the old norm. Let's build back better and differently.
In your work, one of the difficulties is that the immigration policy set by Westminster, and it's very hard line, and it's hard to see how it's going to change. I wonder, do you see any potential for how you could move forward with equality of the communities you deal with? I mean, ultimately the solution would be to change the immigration regime, but what can be done short of that might play into this sort of solidarity and common thread between everyone?
Yeah, it's a strange position, I think, because what we've seen is, despite the lessons of COVID, the Home Office particularly don't seem to be listening. They're continuing to implement policies that will have an awful impact on the most vulnerable in society. We've seen recent sort of rhetoric around asylum seekers, about detention, and there's new legislation coming through that none of which has a positive change, and it is frustrating that can come in the middle of a pandemic, when like everyone has said, the underlying inequalities, have been so clearly exposed, so clearly set out. And I suppose I think it's actually an interesting position to be in Northern Ireland, because we are devolved, and I do think there is a capacity there to look at how devolved powers can be used to sort of push for rights, to push for equality, and this is something where possibly the pandemic has offered a bit of an opportunity, because we have seen throughout that some Stormont departments have been willing to use their devolved powers in a fairly creative way when dealing with COVID issues. So I would be quite hopeful that we can point to that and we can say, look, we know you can do it when you want to. Mm-hmm. We know we can do it. You can do it when all eyes are on you. So let's see you do it against these Home Office policies. Let's see you push back against particularly hostile environment policies. And I think something that I frequently sort of raise in Northern Ireland is we need to look at our own history and our own context, because, the peace process, if you look at the Good Friday Agreement, it's all embedded in human rights and equality, and there's this promise, of a rights-based society, and that's for everyone in society. And exactly as Camilla said, there's a real issue here with just assuming that that's two communities, and it's not. The rights promised there are for everyone in society, and not just for two communities. And I think that I would like to see sort of a bit of a brave and progressive stance here, where we say we don't accept these kind of policies, we don't accept these inequalities, this racism, this discrimination. It's not part of a rights-based society that we want to see here. That would be the hope.
So as we come to the end, for organisations like SCI that sort of work to try to support people doing the work that you do, and also for the different organisations and governmental, non-governmental that support your work, what would be helpful in trying to create some sort of, not just across you on the panel, but more broadly, about trying to sort of create some sort of shared agenda for change that might really have the power to leverage the sort of response that you would want to see in terms of funding, in terms of defining equality or poverty as a central issue? What type of support would help, kind of, given that you're sort of now dealing with what you did deal with, then you're dealing with all the extra COVID stuff, and then, the uncertainty of what comes ahead. How do you actually create some sort of bigger solidarity-based agenda for change? I don't know who wants to come in on that. Has anyone good ideas?
I think what I would like to see is a complete shift when it comes to leadership. Not seeing leadership as it is, but seeing a shift whereby people who are in power understand and know that they need to throw the ladder down for others to climb up. There needs to be meaningful participation. I recently attended a workshop where they were talking about hard to reach communities, and this is often thought about with ethnic minorities. What I would perceive to be hard to reach communities is communities who find it quite hard to engage between each other. That's what I would like to see more. Forums or anything like that get different side of communities to be engaging together, where they are able to listen and respect and not taking over, and make room and don't make assumption, don't ask one person or organization to speak on behalf of everybody. Whilst I'm here now, I am not representative of all ethnic minorities. My experiences would be very different to somebody from the Black community. So that's what I need. We need more participation.
So there was originally in the agreement a civic forum, it could have been a vehicle for things. Is it time to revisit something like that, Debbie?
Yeah, Christine, it's strange. When you initially raised the question, I had written down the civic forum because I know that it hadn't gained fulsome support right across the political divide when it was first floated, but I think it's a fabulous idea, and it's time to revisit something like that, because really what it does is provide a forum for all sections of community to have a voice and to participate in a meaningful way. What I think was lacking from how it was envisaged previously was, did it have teeth? And there's no point having a civic forum that doesn't have a mechanism to influence and have power into our systems and into our political structures. So if it's just a tick box exercise, I don't want to be a part of it. Let's forget it. Let's park it. So I think we do need to revisit something like a civic forum, but it needs to have something that has a meaningful role within our political or changed structures. And all parties need to buy into it, because I know previously some political parties supported it and others saw it as a way of diluting their political mandate. I think that is a very, very flawed analysis. It's about giving marginalized people a voice.
We're nearly out of time. I think that's interesting. I think that was a feeling right at the start when the politicians were so new to getting their power back, but maybe now there would be a feeling that there needs to be a communication mechanism. I wonder, could it be almost like an unofficial second chamber for the Assembly? We're pretty much at the end. I don't think I have time to come back to everybody. Has anyone any last thing they'd like to say in terms of something that has really given you hope? Maybe Seamus?
Yeah, no, in relation, and really quickly in relation to the response or how our community responds to what we've been through. I mean, locally, we set off with that collective sort of group, trying to encompass as many sort of community partners as possible. And that has given us a dynamic. For me, you need to get it right on the ground. I mean, if you don't get it right on the ground, then the voice is lost and it loses impact. I can gladly say that we have been able to respond. We have been able to engage with politicians and have been listening. So on that front, I mean, we need to keep it going. We need to sort of keep on top of it and ensure that we do get a response and these communities get a response and are heard. Listen, I mean, it has been challenging. It's been challenging for all. But listen, there has been so many positive messages. There has been so many positive responses. We have helped each other. We have learned of each other. And I mean, and God spurs us that something like this would come at us again in the future and whatever, then I have no doubt society and these communities would be in a better place.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. But just to say, I really wish you all the best with your work. It's just a uniquely challenging time. But also I think what's really clear is just how vital not just you, but the organisations and the people that you're involved with that are also doing the work are. So I would just sort of express also my interest in seeing some really powerful mechanism evolve collectively around this work. And as a board member of SCI, which I forgot to say at the start, I'll certainly be advocating for SCI and anyone else to support that. So thank you very much.